Okay, imagine the ultimate divine puzzle. When the early church boldly declared God became man, they weren't just throwing around some beautiful abstract poetry to make people feel good, right? They were making a concrete, definitive claim about reality. But who exactly were they talking about? I mean, which part of God? And why does human salvation completely, utterly depend on getting the precise mechanics of this ancient mystery exactly right? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking the intense, incredibly high-stakes debates of the 4th and 5th centuries over how exactly God became human. We often think of theology as just this purely academic exercise, but back then, getting this wrong didn't just mean a theological slap on the wrist. For the early church, getting the mechanics of the incarnation wrong literally breaks the very mechanism of our salvation. Because if the bridge between God and humanity is built with the wrong materials, well, it collapses. Here's a quick roadmap for us. We'll look at the incarnate subject, weigh the word-man versus word-flesh views, explore the false paths of Apollinarianism and Nestorianism, and then finally wrap up with why this Christology deeply, deeply matters. We're going to navigate this dense intellectual forest together, completely jargon-free. So, Section 1, the incarnate subject, separating person from nature. Let's dive right in and establish our very first clue to solving this divine puzzle. The absolute fundamental assertion of the early church was that the second person of the Trinity voluntarily took on a human nature. But to really get this, we have to grasp the critical difference between nature and person. Nature is the what. It's the underlying reality of being God. Person, on the other hand, is the who, the distinct, active agent. It wasn't the entire Trinity acting together to become a man, and it wasn't the divine nature itself just acting as a generic subject. No, it was a specific person, God the Son, stepping right into time and space. Distinguishing the who from the what is absolutely crucial here. And that leads to a fascinating, honestly kind of mind-bending concept, historically called the Patristic extra, or the extra Calvinisticum. This simply means the Son miraculously lived on two levels simultaneously. Picture this. He's experiencing real, physical human life on earth as Jesus of Nazareth, eating, sleeping, walking the dusty roads of Galilee. But at the exact same time, he is entirely unrestrained by the flesh. Even as an infant in a manger, the eternal Son was continuing his cosmic duties of upholding the stars and the galaxies. He's fully present in the human Jesus, yet completely unbounded by him. It is just wild to think about. Moving on to Section 2. Word-man versus word-flesh, the battle over Christ's humanity. As we move forward, we actually see the early church split into two totally distinct ways of understanding the exact makeup of Christ's human side. So we find two deeply competing views attempting to make sense of this. The Antiochians favored what's called word-flesh. They effectively just removed the human soul from the equation. Why? Well, they were really trying to protect God from experiencing the profound anguish, doubt, and limitations of a human soul. They wanted a transcendent God. But the Alexandrians rightly insisted on word-man. They argued, no, the Son took a completely human nature, both a physical body and a distinct human soul, complete with human psychology, grief, and a human will. You could already kind of see the tension building here, right? Which brings us to Section 3, false path, Apollinarianism, and the danger of an incomplete savior. This is our first well-intentioned, but ultimately disastrous, attempt to solve the mystery. Apollinarius had a fascinating, yet completely flawed logic. He was a fierce defender of Christ's absolute deity, but to protect it, he basically taught that Jesus had a purely human body while the divine word swapped in to act as his brain and soul. Think of it almost like a divine pilot, actually scratch that, more like a divine hard drive plugged inside a human shell. By doing this, he essentially created a composite, blended nature, part human flesh, part divine mind. It sounds like a super neat solution on paper, but it completely unravels human salvation. The broader church vehemently rejected this idea, and they were anchored by this absolute mic drop of a rebuttal from Gregory of Nazianzus. He said, "What is not assumed is not healed." This single sentence proves exactly what was at stake. In this context, assumed means to take on or to adopt. If Christ didn't assume a human mind, if he didn't literally take on human intellect, emotions, and a soul, then he couldn't save that part of us. The disease of sin affects the mind and the soul just as much as the physical body, so the cure absolutely has to reach those places too. So why does Apollinarianism completely fail? Because if Jesus didn't possess a human mind or a human soul, he couldn't truly represent us as our substitute. A divine brain wearing a human suit hasn't actually entered into the full, agonizing human experience. He didn't just come to be a savior for human biology, right? He came to heal the entirety of our broken humanity, and that includes our desperately broken minds and souls. An incomplete human means incomplete salvation. It leaves our inner selves entirely unredeemed. Now, Section 4. False path, Nestorianism, and the danger of a divided savior. Watch how the pendulum swings the complete opposite way as theologians try to avoid making Apollinarius' mistake. While Apollinarius blended the natures together and lost the human soul in the process, Nestorius kept the two complete natures fully intact. But he completely divided the person. He essentially split Jesus into two cooperating subjects living inside one historical figure. It was just an overcorrection of monumental proportions. The scholar Fairbairn brilliantly illustrates Nestorius' view as a two-partner firm. It makes Jesus look way more like a corporate partnership than a single unified savior. You have the visible human partner out there doing the actual work on earth, suffering, bleeding, dying, while the silent divine partner is just kind of influencing things from behind the scenes in the boardroom. They're cooperating, sure, but they are absolutely not the same subject. It totally strips the awe right out of the incarnation. And this deep division is exactly why Nestorius rejected the vital term Theotokos for Mary, which translates to God-bearer. Nestorius argued that Mary only gave birth to the human partner of the firm, so calling her the Mother of God was inappropriate. But for Orthodox believers like Cyril of Alexandria, this was a massive, waving red flag. They fiercely insisted Mary gave birth to God the Son incarnate. And this wasn't about elevating Mary, by the way. It was about protecting the identity of Jesus. He wasn't just some regular human guy who was later joined to God in a partnership. No, he was God from the very moment of conception. Which brings us to Section 5, Why Christology Matters, the Mechanics of Salvation. This is the big question. Why exactly did the early church fight so fiercely, sometimes resulting in exile and schism, over these deeply philosophical, hyper-specific details? Let's look at the scoreboard. Both of these false paths fundamentally break the mechanics of salvation. Apollinarianism fails because, without a human soul, it can't heal the whole human person. It just offers a fractured cure for a deeply fractured humanity. Nestorianism, on the other hand, fails because dividing Jesus into two subjects gives us a mere man who is simply cooperating with God, rather than God himself entering the fray to act and save us. A cooperative man, no matter how perfectly aligned with the divine will, simply cannot save the world. God alone must act. And that brilliantly illustrates the true solution that was finally and painstakingly established at the Council of Chalcedon. Orthodoxy insists on one single person, the eternal Son. He is the active who, but he possesses two complete, unblended natures, fully God and fully man. They're united without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. The active, single subject of both full natures is the eternal Son. He acts flawlessly on our behalf to save a humanity he fully understands because he fully became it. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought about the absolute necessity of the incarnation. Think about it. If God himself didn't step completely into our humanity, taking on a real human mind, a human body, and a human soul to fight our greatest battles from the inside out, how could broken humanity ever hope to reach God? Having a perfect, undivided Savior who is simultaneously fully God and fully man, it's not just some abstract theological riddle. It changes absolutely everything. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.